My name is Elizabeth Archer, and I am 26 years old. Exactly 48 hours ago, my father's personal driver rang the doorbell of my rented apartment. It was the first time I had seen anyone from my family in 2 years. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was managing to pay rent on a waitress's salary. He simply dropped a heavy navy blue leather binder onto my kitchen table. "Mr. Archer wants you to have your records," he said, and left before I could even process the weight of the book. 42 items, all labeled, all dated, all neatly categorized in chronological order, a complete itemized receipt of my entire upbringing. Every private school tuition, every cello lesson, every designer dress purchased for charity galas, and even the hospital bill from the day I was born. At the very bottom, there was a sticky note in my mother's flawless, elegant cursive, "A investment that failed to mature." Let me take you back to the summer I turned 24, the summer my family decided I no longer belonged to the Archer name, Greenwich, Connecticut. Population 60,000, but only about 200 families actually mattered. Mine was one of them. My father, Richard, was a senior partner at a corporate law firm that occupied 3 floors of a Manhattan skyscraper. Same pristine white shirts, same custom-tailored Italian suits, same cold, calculating silence when he walked through the front door at exactly 7:15 every evening. My mother, Catherine, was a woman who lived for optics. She managed our family's social calendar like a general preparing for war. Every charity gala, every country club lunch, and every family photograph was a calculated move to maintain a flawless facade. My younger sister, Beatrice, was the golden child. She was loud, demanding, and exactly the kind of girl who expected the world to bow to her, and my parents did. Every whim, every expensive hobby, every failed business venture of hers was quietly funded and covered up. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who studied finance, got the top grades, and never caused a single scandal. I kept that sticky note from my mother. It's currently taped to the inside of my cheap nightstand. It reminds me of the exact moment I realized love in my family was never unconditional. It was a transaction, and I was the asset that refused to comply. Meet Thomas Vance during my final year of graduate school. He wasn't a corporate lawyer, nor was he the heir to a hedge fund. Thomas was a restoration specialist working in the historical archives of the city library. He had a degree in historical architecture from a state university and a massive mountain of student debt. His father was a retired carpenter, his mother a middle school librarian. The first time we met, I accidentally dropped my laptop case in the library basement, shattering the screen. Thomas didn't just help me pick up the pieces. He spent 3 hours fixing the internal hard drive so I wouldn't lose my thesis. He was patient. He listened in a way that made you feel like your words actually carried weight. He told me he wanted to rebuild things. He wanted to preserve history, to save beautiful old structures that the modern corporate world wanted to tear down and replace with glass towers. I told him I wanted a life where numbers actually meant something real, not just figures on a wealthy family's tax evasion sheet. The first time my mother met Thomas, she called him the technician instead of his name. The second time, she completely ignored his presence at a charity brunch, talking over him as if he were part of the catering staff. At Thanksgiving, my father finally sat me down in his private study. The air smelled of expensive scotch and Cuban cigars. "He is an anchor, Elizabeth," my father said, not looking up from his legal briefs. "He will drag you down to his level. A girl of your standing does not marry a man who earns in a year what your father spends on a country club membership." "I don't care about the club membership, Dad," I replied, my voice steady despite the racing of my heart. "I care about how he treats people. I care about how he treats me." My father finally looked up, his eyes cold and dark. "You think this is a romance novel, Elizabeth? This is reality. If you marry this man, you are choosing him over everything this family has built for you. Choose wisely." 2 weeks later, on a rainy Tuesday morning, Thomas proposed to me. No flash mobs, no expensive photographers hiding in the bushes. Just a quiet park bench, a thermos of black coffee, and a simple silver band he had forged himself from old reclaimed metal. It was imperfect, beautiful, and completely real. I said yes before he could even finish the sentence. I called my mother that evening. The phone rang 4 times. When she finally answered, her voice was clipped. "So, you've made your decision," she said. No congratulations, no joy, just a flat statement of fact. 2 days later, my sister Beatrice texted me, "Mama's been locked in her room crying for 48 hours because of the embarrassment you've caused. I hope you're happy with your choice." We got married at the City Hall on a Thursday afternoon. Total cost, $85. There were no flowers, no white silk dresses, and no three-tiered cakes. Just Thomas, myself, and 2 of his friends from the archive who acted as witnesses. My family did not attend. They didn't even send a card. Instead, that very morning, my personal bank accounts were wiped clean. My corporate credit card, which was tied to my father's firm, was deactivated while I was trying to buy groceries. When I returned to my parents' estate to collect my belongings, I wasn't even allowed past the security gate. The guard, a man I had known since I was 7 years old, looked down at his clipboard, refusing to meet my eyes. "I'm sorry, Miss Elizabeth," he muttered. "Mr. Archer gave strict orders. Your belongings have been sent to the address on file." The address on file was Thomas's cramped 500-square-foot apartment on the edge of the industrial district. When I got there, 2 battered cardboard boxes were sitting on the sidewalk under the pouring rain. Inside were my childhood journals, a few favorite books, and my college diploma. Everything else, my designer clothes, my jewelry, the oil paintings I had collected, had been kept, disowned, erased. I printed out my father's final text message. I didn't do it out of sadness. I did it as a blueprint for my survival. The text read, "You have chosen poverty over your bloodline. Do not contact us when the reality of your choice sets in. You are no longer an Archer." I framed that text and put it right next to our marriage certificate. The first year was survival mode. Thomas worked 60 hours a week at the archives, his hands constantly stained with ink and dust. I took a job as an overnight data analyst for a mid-sized logistics company, working from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., while studying for my forensic accountant certification during the day. We survived on instant noodles, discounted produce, and the sheer unyielding determination to prove them wrong. Between the 2 of us, we understood the exact nature of our problem. My family wanted me to crawl back on my knees, begging for forgiveness. We refused to give them the satisfaction. By year 2, things began to shift. Thomas discovered a series of misvalued historical blueprints in the city's forgotten vault. Documents that proved a major real estate developer was trying to illegally demolish a protected landmark. Instead of selling the information or staying quiet, Thomas brought the files to me. Together, we built a comprehensive, airtight compliance case. I built the financial forensic model showing the developer's tax fraud. Thomas provided the historical and architectural proof. We didn't take it to the press. We took it directly to the federal regulators. That was the year we stopped just surviving. That was the year we founded Vance and Associates. Yesterday, my sister Beatrice posted a photo on Instagram from her lavish engagement party at the plaza. My mother was smiling widely in the background, draped in diamonds. In the comments, a family friend asked why Elizabeth wasn't in the photo. My mother's official account replied, "We only have one daughter. Beatrice is our entire world." I sat in my new office, looking at the navy blue leather binder my father's driver had left on my table. I opened it to the very last page, took out a bright red pen, and wrote a single line across my mother's sticky note. "Account settled in full, interest accruing." I closed the book, locked it in the bottom drawer of my desk, and looked out the window at the city skyline. They thought they had broken me by throwing me out into the cold. They didn't realize they had just let me out of the cage. It takes exactly 365 days to unlearn the habits of wealth, but it takes less than a week to learn the brutal mechanics of survival. When you grow up with a safety net, you never look at the ground. But when that net is ripped away by your own flesh and blood, every step you take feels like walking on a tightrope over a canyon. By the start of our second year of marriage, Thomas and I had developed a rhythm born out of necessity. We didn't talk about what we had lost. We only talked about what we were building. 18 months after my father disowned me, I received a Google Drive notification on my old personal email address. It was a shared folder from an anonymous account titled Project Liquidation. Inside were scanned copies of my signature being legally removed from the family trust funds, the title deeds to the summer house in Maine, and the medical insurance policy. Every digital tie had been severed with surgical precision. I didn't cry. Instead, I downloaded the PDFs, moved them to an encrypted hard drive labeled the Motivation Archive, and went back to analyzing spreadsheet data for my night shift job. Our apartment was located above a commercial bakery on 4th Street. Every morning at 4 a.m., the smell of industrial yeast and burning sugar would seep through our floorboards, waking us up before our alarms even had a chance to ring. The radiator clanked like a dying machine every time the temperature dropped below freezing, and the kitchen counter was made of cheap, warped formica that was permanently stained with coffee rings. But it was ours. Every square inch of that cramped space was paid for with money my father hadn't touched. Thomas was changing too. The quiet academic researcher I met in the library basement was hardening into a businessman. After we successfully brought the real estate developer's historical fraud to the federal regulators, the city's Preservation Society awarded Thomas a small independent consultancy contract. It wasn't $1 million payout, but it was $5,000 of clean, undisputed capital. We didn't spend a single cent of it on ourselves. We didn't buy new clothes, we didn't go out to celebrate, and we didn't upgrade our broken laptop. We took that $5,000 and opened a business checking account under the name Vance & Associates, LLC. I remember the bank teller looking at our worn winter coats and mismatched shoes, her expression a mix of pity and professional indifference. She didn't know that the woman sitting across from her used to have a private wealth manager at J.P. Morgan who would sprint down the hallway just to hand-deliver a glass of sparkling water. "What is the primary nature of the business?" the teller asked, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. I leaned forward, my voice dropping into the same cold, authoritative register my father used before delivering a closing argument in court. "Forensic asset tracking and regulatory compliance for independent architectural projects," I said. Thomas looked at me, a small, knowing smile playing at the corner of his lips. He knew exactly what I was doing. I was turning my elite corporate education into a weapon. Our first major client was a man named Arthur Pendleton, a retired shipbuilder who wanted to restore an old abandoned textile mill on the riverfront. The local city council, heavily subsidized by a massive commercial conglomerate, was trying to condemn the building to force a cheap buyout. Arthur was desperate. He had spent his entire life savings purchasing the property, and now the system was chewing him up. He came to our tiny apartment office because he couldn't afford the $500 an hour retainer fees of the downtown firms. "They say my environmental permits are invalid, Elizabeth," Arthur said, his rough hands trembling as he laid out a stack of crumpled government notices on our Formica table. "They claim the soil report from 1994 shows chemical contamination that can't be remediated. I know it's a lie, but I don't have the resources to dig through 30 years of City Hall paperwork to prove it." I looked at the documents. Within 10 minutes, I spotted the pattern. The signature on the environmental condemnation order belonged to a deputy commissioner named Marcus Sterling. Sterling was a frequent guest at my father's country club. In fact, I distinctly remembered him sitting on our patio 3 summers ago, laughing with my father about a golf course expansion project. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with a sickening thud. The conglomerate trying to buy out Arthur's mill was a shell company managed by one of my father's primary corporate clients. "We'll take the case, Arthur," I said. Thomas looked at me, his eyes widening slightly. "Our fee will be 10% of the property's protected valuation, payable only after we win. You don't owe us a dime until the condemnation order is permanently lifted." After Arthur left, Thomas locked the door and turned to me. "Elizabeth, that's Archer and Associates territory. Your father's firm handles the legal zoning for that entire development cluster. If we interfere, they will notice." "Good," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Let them notice. My father taught me how to read a balance sheet before I knew how to drive a car. He always said the biggest mistake a corporation can make is assuming their opponents are too poor to fight back. He thinks I'm weak because I don't have his checkbook. Let's show him what happens when someone uses his own playbook against him. For the next 6 weeks, our apartment turned into a war room. Thomas spent his days in the sub-basement of the municipal archives, tracking down the original 1994 geological surveys and land use deeds. I stayed up during the nights, running cross-reference checks on the shell company's financial filings through public SEC databases. My eyes were permanently bloodshot, my fingers ached from typing, and my diet consisted almost entirely of black coffee and stale bread. On week 4, Thomas found it. Buried inside a mislabeled box of public works receipts from 3 decades ago was the original, unedited soil report for the riverfront mill. It was completely clean. The report my father's client had submitted to the city council was a forged modification, altered to create the illusion of toxic contamination. Even worse, the digital metadata on the forged PDF file showed it had been exported from a computer terminal registered directly to Archer and Associates. I didn't call my father. I didn't send a dramatic email threatening exposure. That's what amateurs do. Instead, I compiled a 40-page itemized fraud report, complete with matching serial numbers, verified timestamps, and certified copies of the original municipal records. I packaged it in a plain unmarked envelope and mailed it directly to the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Division, carbon copying the Regional Environmental Protection Board. The response was immediate. 2 weeks later, the City Council quietly withdrew the condemnation order against Arthur Pendleton's mill. The local news ran a tiny 4-line blurb on page 12 about an administrative oversight regarding riverfront zoning. But the real impact happened behind closed doors. The conglomerate's multi-million-dollar development project collapsed overnight, and the shell company was hit with a federal audit. On Friday morning, Arthur Pendleton walked into our office and placed a certified cashier's check on our table. $45,000. It was more money than Thomas and I had earned combined over the past 2 years. We looked at the check, then at each other. There was no screaming, no jumping for joy, just a deep collective sigh of relief. We were no longer just surviving, we had capital. That evening, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. I answered it in silence. Elizabeth, my mother's voice came through the speaker, crisp, elegant, and entirely strained. She didn't ask about my life. She didn't ask about Thomas. Your father's firm lost a very significant client this week due to some malicious interference with a riverfront development. Your sister Beatrice's future father-in-law was a major investor in that project. Her wedding budget has been cut in half because of this embarrassment. That sounds like a compliance issue, Mother, I replied, my voice completely flat. Perhaps they should have checked the validity of their soil reports before investing millions of dollars. Don't play stupid with me, Elizabeth, she hissed, her social facade cracking for a brief second. We know it was your little boutique agency that filed the regulatory complaint. You are destroying this family's reputation out of spite because we wouldn't fund your ridiculous marriage. You didn't just refuse to fund it, Mother. You itemized my childhood and threw my journals on a wet sidewalk, I said, looking down at the cashier's check sitting on my desk. Tell Father that Vance and Associates is just getting started. If he wants to protect his clients, tell him he needs to start hiring better accountants, because I can see every single crack in his foundation. I hung up before she could respond, walked over to our cheap whiteboard, and wrote our new corporate slogan at the top. The asset has become the competitor. Exactly 4 years and 3 months after I was locked out of my family's estate, my father's personal assistant called my secretary to book a consultation. Not a family dinner, not a private meeting in his study, a formal corporate booking. The fee for a priority analysis at Vance and Associates was now $3,000 an hour. My father paid the invoice within 6 minutes of receiving the digital link. When he walked into my corner office on the 24th floor of the Exchange Building, he looked older. The sharp military posture was gone. His custom-tailored suit looked slightly loose around his shoulders. He didn't look at the panoramic view of the harbor. He didn't look at the mahogany desk or the digital tickers displaying our compliance metrics. His eyes went straight to the wall behind my chair. Framed in cheap black plastic right next to my forensic accounting master's diploma was his final text message from 4 years ago. You have chosen poverty over your bloodline. You are no longer an archer. You've done well for yourself, Elizabeth, he said, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone that used to make me freeze as a child. This time my heart rate didn't even skip a beat. I sat down, clicked my pen, and opened a fresh, empty manila folder. Your assistant logged this as an emergency regulatory crisis, Richard, I said, intentionally using his first name. We have 42 minutes left of your paid hour. He winced slightly, then pulled a thick red plastic binder from his leather briefcase. It was the exact opposite of the pristine navy blue ledger he had sent me years ago. This one was messy, filled with sticky notes, highlighted tax codes, and internal audit warnings. For the past 18 months, Archer and Associates had been managing the offshore trusts and restructuring funds for Beatrice's husband's family, the same elite conglomerate that had tried to forge the soil reports on the riverfront mill. The federal regulators are freezing the primary accounts on Monday morning, my father said, leaning forward, his hands flat on my desk. An internal whistleblower leaked 5 years of transaction logs showing structured tax evasion. If those accounts are locked, our firm's malpractice insurance won't cover the liability. Every asset I own, the Greenwich estate, the townhouses, the corporate shares, is tied up as collateral for their liquidity loans. We are looking at total liquidation, Elizabeth, bankruptcy, criminal indictments. I pulled the red binder toward me and began flipping through the pages. My eyes scanned the columns of numbers, tracing the wire transfers through shell companies in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. It was an incredibly arrogant piece of financial engineering. My father's firm hadn't just audited these accounts, they had designed the loophole structure, and they had left his personal digital signature on the authorization compliance sheets. Who designed this module? I asked, pointing to a particularly sloppy series of cross-border transfers from 2024. My father cleared his throat, looking down at his polished shoes. Beatrice's husband, he muttered. He wanted to prove he could handle the high-yield portfolios. Beatrice insisted we give him the lead position on the account. I didn't verify the final compliance logs. I trusted her judgment. I let out a short, cold laugh. It was the exact same dynamic from my childhood. Beatrice wanted something shiny to play with. My parents funded it without question. And now the entire structure was collapsing because nobody bothered to check if the foundation was real. So the golden child built a house of cards, and you signed your name on the bottom line, I said, closing the folder with a sharp thud. You can untangle this, Elizabeth, my father said, his voice dropping into a desperate plea. Your agency has the highest clearance rating with the Federal Compliance Board. If Vance and Associates steps in as the independent restructuring auditor, you can file an administrative deferral. You can isolate the liability to the shell companies and insulate the law firm. You can save the family name. Why would I do that? I asked, looking him dead in the eye. 4 years ago, you told me that love doesn't pay the bills or build status. You told me I had chosen poverty. You erased me from the trust, blocked my medical insurance, and left my childhood journals to rot on a wet sidewalk. You told me never to contact you when the reality of my choice set in. Well, Richard, the reality of your choice has set in. Why should my corporate capital be used to bail out your failed investment? Before he could answer, the door to my office opened. Thomas walked in, holding a rolled-up architectural blueprint. He was wearing a sharp charcoal gray wool suit, his hair neatly cut, his posture relaxed but commanding. He didn't look like the tired, ink-stained archivist from the 4th Street apartment. He looked like the managing partner of a multi-million-dollar compliance firm. He stopped when he saw my father, then looked at me. The state attorney's office just confirmed the scheduling for the riverfront project clearance, Elizabeth, Thomas said, completely ignoring my father's presence. My father stood up, turning to face Thomas. Thomas, look, I know we had our differences, but this is family. Elizabeth's mother is devastated. Beatrice's entire life will be ruined if these indictments go through. We can find a position for your agency within our corporate network, a permanent retainer, $500,000 annually. Thomas didn't look angry. He looked amused. He walked over to my desk, set the blueprints down, and placed his hand gently on my shoulder. The simple silver band he had forged for me years ago caught the afternoon light. "Mr. Archer," Thomas said, his voice calm and steady. "When we started Vance and Associates, we had exactly $5,000 and a 40-page fraud report. We built this firm on data, compliance, and absolute transparency. We don't take bribes disguised as retainers, and we certainly don't protect bad assets." I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the navy blue leather binder my father's driver had dropped on my kitchen table years ago, the itemized receipt of my upbringing. I slid it across the mahogany surface, placing it right on top of his red disaster folder. "There are 42 items in this book, Richard," I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, lethal whisper. "You itemized every cent you ever spent on me to prove I owed you my life. Well, I've done some forensic accounting of my own. The market value of the regulatory work required to save your firm from federal indictments is exactly $4.2 million. It matches the exact total of the asset liquidation you took from my inheritance, adjusted for 4 years of market inflation." My father looked at the navy blue book, his hands trembling. "Are you saying you'll take the case?" he whispered, a desperate spark of hope in his eyes. "No," I said, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. "I'm saying the account is closed. I don't owe you my future, and you no longer have a past to sell me. On Monday morning, Vance and Associates will be submitting our independent data analysis to the federal board. We won't be hiding your digital signatures. We will be verifying them." My father stared at me, his face turning pale as the realization finally hit him. There was no negotiation left. No wealth, no influence, no family leverage could save him from the numbers he had signed his name to. He slowly picked up his folders, closed his briefcase, and walked out of my office without saying another word. He looked small. An hour later, my mother texted my personal phone. It was the first text message from her in 48 months. It read, "How can you be so cold? We are your blood. We gave you your name." I didn't delete the text. I took a screenshot, printed it out, and walked over to the black plastic frame on my wall. I took out my red pen, wrote the final timestamp across the bottom of the page, and filed it under a new digital archive labeled "Case Closed." Thomas walked over to the window, watching my father's town car pull away from the curb into the heavy evening traffic below. He turned back to me, a quiet, peaceful smile on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked. I walked over, slipping my hand into his, feeling the cool, familiar metal of the ring he had made for me. "I'm perfect," I said, looking out at the city we had conquered together. "The audit is finished. We're completely free." "There are 42 items in this book, Richard," I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, lethal whisper. "You itemized every cent you ever spent on me to prove I owed you my life. Well, I've done some forensic accounting of my own. The market value of the regulatory work required to save your firm from federal indictments is exactly $4.2 million. It matches the exact total of the asset liquidation you took from my inheritance, adjusted for 4 years of market inflation." My father looked at the navy blue book, his hands trembling. "Are you saying you'll take the case?" he whispered, a desperate spark of hope in his eyes. "No," I said, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. "I'm saying the account is closed. I don't owe you my future, and you no longer have a past to sell me. On Monday morning, Vance and Associates will be submitting our independent data analysis to the federal board. We won't be hiding your digital signatures. We will be verifying them." My father stared at me, his face turning pale as the realization finally hit him. There was no negotiation left. No wealth, no influence, no family leverage could save him from the numbers he had signed his name to. He slowly picked up his folders, closed his briefcase, and walked out of my office without saying another word. He looked small. An hour later, my mother texted my personal phone. It was the first text message from her in 48 months. It read, How can you be so cold? We are your blood. We gave you your name. I didn't delete the text. I took a screenshot, printed it out, and walked over to the black plastic frame on my wall. I took out my red pen, wrote the final timestamp across the bottom of the page, and filed it under a new digital archive labeled Case Closed. Thomas walked over to the window, watching my father's town car pull away from the curb into the heavy evening traffic below. He turned back to me, a quiet, peaceful smile on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked. I walked over, slipping my hand into his, feeling the cool, familiar metal of the ring he had made for me. "I'm perfect," I said, looking out at the city we had conquered together. "The audit is finished. We're completely free.